That's a joke. This is a little more serious. In China and Nepal, they use this Cordyceps sinensis. It's a traditional medicine in those countries, and they claim that it will lower your blood pressure, it will cure cancer, it will perform just about any miracle that you care to investigate. I'm going to skip this little bit here. When I was a child, when I was 10 years old, that was the first time I ever met a South African, actually. It was when I was 10 years old. We had a boarder come and stay from South Africa. But this was 1968, and that was the first human heart transplant, the first successful human heart transplant. And I think people who are my age or older would remember this. This was a real miracle. Christian Barnard. And, but the reason it was so difficult to transplant the human heart was because the body would reject any organ you put in it. It didn't want foreign organs in. And now we have this miracle drug called cyclosporin A. And this comes from a fungus here called Talipocladium album, and this is an old form of a cordyceps. So, and this was collected in Norway by an employee of Sandoz, the pharmaceutical company that went off. They used to have their employees take little baggies and teaspoons wherever they went on holiday and bring back some soil. And that's how they found this fungus. This compound has saved hundreds of thousands of human lives in the last 25 years, roughly, and also makes a tidy about $1 billion a year profit for the pharmaceutical companies that make it. So Phytophthora, now the stories unfortunately start to get a bit dark. This very famous painting by the painter Vincent van Gogh to you. This painting was in 1885, and what this shows is a poor family of peasants in the Netherlands, in this case, eating their potatoes. And the thing about potatoes was that it was the food for the poor in Europe. But it was a food that they could grow themselves. This painting, done at the time of 1847, shows the beginning of the potato blight in Ireland. Now I'm sure most of you know a bit about the potato blight in Ireland, but it was a combination of strange events. So the potato comes from Peru. So how did the Irish peasants become dependent on a plant that came from Peru? Well, they grew it because they could grow a little bit on a land that, half the size of this stage. They could feed their family with potatoes. But they didn't own their land. Their land was owned by rich English people who let them stay on the land if they would grow wheat for them. Wheat comes from the Middle East. It doesn't come from the UK either. But so the peasants could grow the wheat, and then the landowners took the wheat away, and the peasants would end up with the potatoes. And so then things started to go wrong. This was about in the 1840s. When Montaigne there, he was a Frenchman, and he'd been a surgeon in Napoleon's army, and he got tired of that, and he came back and he became a scientist. And then there was the Reverend Miles Joseph Berkeley from the UK, very famous man. They claimed, so there was this potato disease starting in the UK first, and then it spread into Ireland. And they claimed that this disease is crazy, it's nuts. They claimed this disease was caused by a fungus. Could you imagine? This was before Pasteur's germ theory. That was 1852. This is about 10 years before Pasteur. And they were claiming, they made this ludicrous claim that it was caused by disease, caused by a fungus. Everybody knew that this disease was caused by electricity. I mean, electricity was new then. And so it coincided, either that or trains, because trains were new too. So the trains would cross the countryside and kill all the potatoes. Everybody knew that. So this is the disease, still with us today. It happens in cold, wet weather. The leaves just kind of get slimy and collapse, and the whole plant just collapses. They call it late blight because it unfortunately occurs late in the growing season. So you think you've got a nice crop of potatoes, and then within 2 days it looks like this. So let's play Google Leaf now. Just underneath the leaf, there's these candelabra-like structures hanging down, and they drop the spores onto the soil. And this is a surprising fungus because I'll show you that in the next slide. This is what the potatoes look like. Would you want to eat that? The peasants did anyway. They didn't have anything else, so they would try to do things. They would try to store them, and they would just hope, that they could make it through the winter. And of course, many of them couldn't. This fungus makes spores that swim. So you can see them swimming around like this. They're called zoospores, which means animal spores. And when you look at a high magnification SEM, you see that these spores actually have 2 little flippers that they wave around like that, and that's how they swim around. But that's the connection with the wet. So when it gets wet, the spores can swim around, and they can go very far. So this happened. The Irish started to emigrate, and they were poor. 1 million of them died of starvation over the course of about 5 years, and about 1 million tried to leave, and many of them tried to come to Canada. So this is a book and a movie called Death or Canada, and I find that a strange choice. Death or Canada? Which one do you like? Which one is better? Anyway, of course there were people who exploited these immigrants, just as there are today. And so that diagram on the upper left is intended to show Irish people sleeping on this boat. And these boats were so crowded that they came to be called ghost ships, because they would try to cross the ocean and people would just start dying. And if the boat sank, then it was called a coffin ship. And this is the memorial to the Irish famine in Ireland, in Morris County on the west coast. So it's looking out at the Atlantic Ocean where all of these Irish people perished. And it's a quite macabre scene with all of the skeletons hanging off of them, the boat. So these people came to Canada, and this is what they saw. If they made it across the ocean and they were still alive and they hadn't yet succumbed to typhus, they would see the promised land, right, arising out of the sea like some kind of mirage. And they were sent to a place in Canada called Grosse Ile, which in French means the Big Island. And you can go there today as a tourist, which I've done a couple of times, and this is what it looks like. You come in at the dock. When you come in at the dock, they pretend that you've come in off of a coffin ship or a ghost ship, and that you might have typhus. So there's a doctor and there's nurses, and they come up to you and they start asking questions about, have you had a fever? Have you had any swelling on your glands? Welcome to Canada. They take away your clothes. They don't do that to the tourists, but if you were one of those people at that time, they would take away your clothes, they would autoclave them. And this is interesting because Pasteur had just published his germ theory then. This is 1854, 1855. It was 2 or 3 years later. And this was a very controversial thing. People didn't really believe that germs caused disease. But the doctor that ran this place believed Pasteur, and he said, we're going to sterilize everybody's clothes, and we're going to sterilize their bodies if we can. I took the picture out of the shower, but it's a very crude-looking shower. I can imagine these people really felt terrible by the time they got through this process. And while this was going on, their ship would be fumigated with sulfur. So basically boiling sulfuric acid to try to clean the contagion out of the ships. This is the last remaining hospital on Grosse Ile, and when you go inside, there's not very